Her steps echoed hollowly off the cold stone walls. Panic clawed at her chest as Yurei ran through the darkness. She was in a forbidden part of the tower, one of the many she had spent months exploring to try and find hidden lore. Something to give her some form of advantage or edge in her practice. A decision she was deeply regretting now as she had realized why some sections were locked off for the safety of the students. Her heart was pounding like a war drum against her ribs. The marks on her face were running with blood as she frantically uttered the words of seeing, causing the jelly of her eyes to shift and twist into that of a beast, allowing her to see clearly in the darkness of these halls. In her hand, she clutched something small and heavy, a stone ornament etched with spiraling lines and cryptic engravings. A chittering screech tore through the hall behind her. Guttural, unnatural, a wet symphony of flesh and snapping jaws. The sound made her stomach lurch. In her panic, she entered a large chamber. She frantically looked for anything she could hide behind, spotting a large abandoned stone tablet, also engraved with those oh-so-familiar spiraling shapes that decorated the insides of the tower. Sliding behind the massive stone tablets, panting, she held her breath as the creature entered. From the glimpses she had stolen of it, it appeared as a tangled mess of limbs and flesh, layered over each other like a grotesque model of a beast pulled straight from a sculptor's nightmare. It sampled the air, clicking and chittering as it explored the pitch-dark room. She could hear it padding around the room, exploring methodically and intelligently, like a fox sniffing at a rodent's den. Yurei was panicking, her eyes closed in an animal fear as she tried to calm her thundering heartbeat, fearing it would give her away to this creature of nightmare. It was then Yurei felt it on the other side of the stone. The chittering snarls of that creature's horrid maw grew louder and more focused before abruptly stopping. Anticipation of death washed over her in a cold wave. "Stupid girl, stupid," she thought to herself, scratching her face in frustration and fear. She prayed silently to any god who might be listening. And then from the darkness, a voice called her name. A boy, no, a man now, shouted it, his concern sharp and urgent. "Yurei!" A sharp whine from the creature as it shifted its focus to the sudden intrusion, its mandibled jaw clattering in excitement when it heard another cry of, "Yurei, are you there?" The creature bolted from the chamber. That boy, Daichi, had followed her in. Like a limpet to a boulder at low tide, he had clung to her over the past year, despite her disinterest. While she had been fond of him, she had kept friends at the monastery, but it did neither of them any good in that final test. Much like Daichi's insistence on sticking around was but to get him killed. As the creature disappeared into the tunnels, Yurei seized the precious moments to flee. Her feet pounded the dark halls, adrenaline coursing through her system. The echoes of the monster hunting its prey mixed with Daichi's screams of terror before a sudden silence cut them off, haunting the air behind her as she desperately made her way to an exit. She soon found it in the dim light, the stone door that was only unlocked via usage of the voice, which she began to recite. But even now she could feel the chittering mass returning, drawn by her chants. The spiraling stone responded to her command. She desperately pressed herself against the opening as it appeared, the creature gaining on her position as the door moved excruciatingly slowly. The crack widened just enough for her to squeeze through, reciting the closing words, forcing herself through to ignore the rising horror behind her. Her foot just cleared the doorway, narrowly avoiding its closure as the creature slammed against the rock door behind her. Its screeches muffled, but still dreadfully audible, as she could hear it slam determined against the stone, howling in frustration. As she caught her breath, rasping, she turned to see her, Ko, her mentor, standing before her. Sacrificing the boy for your gain? Resourceful, but perhaps not the wisest choice if you're hoping to make allies go. As ever, Ko held no sympathies for the students. Yurei stood there, digesting what had just happened before beginning to break down with guilt. The cost of her escape was Daishi's life. While not close to her, as she had guarded herself any closeness, and Daishi was certainly not the first to die, but he was the first to die directly because of her. Tears began to well in her eyes as she collapsed to the floor. I did not mean to get him killed. He just kept following me. I told him not to. And if he had listened to you, girl, it would be you who was dead, Ko said, matter-of-factly. That boy was your second chance. Make use of the prize you claimed, Yurei. You will need it. Some of the other students have long surpassed your own ability due to your excursions into the tower. And with that, Ko left, Yurei racking through her emotions in that dark hall, alone. Later that night, Yurei stood silently at the funeral rites for Daichi. His body had been badly maimed by that creature that patrolled that section of the tower, speakers having gone to reclaim his body. A simple white sheet now had been placed over him to shroud what remained. Around him, about 10 students gathered, those faces solemn in the dim light of the speaker's hall. Among them was Akane, one of the most advanced students who was close with Daishi. Her deep scars weeping blood almost constantly, she hummed the ritual chants alongside her mentor, the sound vibrating through the hall, a mixture of reverence and power. Yurei met Akane's gaze and found a steely determination there. Blood pooled in her eyes, coursing down her cheeks like tears, yet her expression remained unyielding. The funeral rite began in earnest. The students and speakers joined in harmonious resonance, each voice amplifying the ritual's power. As the chant reached its peak, Daichi's body, covered by that sheet, began to flake into dark, ashen fragments. The flesh dissolving into the fragments then floated off into the air of the speaker's hall, leaving only bones behind, clean and bare on the stone altar. When the ritual concluded, the bones were carefully gathered by one of the fellow students and placed into a small, ornate box. The speaker, who had guided the rite, took the box and walked through a stone doorway, leaving the hall quiet, except for the faint echo of that final chant. As the students slowly filtered out, back to the practice halls and the chambers, it left the massive hall empty, with just Yurei and Akane. I'm sorry for what happened to Daichi. Akane, I told him not to follow me. Apologies don't help the dead, Yurei. Her tone was shockingly measured and calm, evidence of her emotional control of her voice. Why were you in a forbidden part of the tower? She questioned, her tone accusatory. I was after anything that could give me an edge, some forgotten script, ancient phrasing perhaps. And did you find it, Yurei? Was it worth his life? Yurei hesitated, her voice catching. No, I didn't. Despite her control, Yurei could see the derision written as clear as day on Akane's visage. However, it was schooled quickly. What a waste. Her eyes glanced to the empty altar, her fingers tracing through the remnants of the dust. Yurei, still racked with guilt, stammered and went to say something else, but found it stuck in her throat, Akane cutting her off. Don't embarrass yourself further with your failure. With that, she turned to leave. That night, Yurei sat in her sleeping space, the harsh thin mat of tatami beneath her as she sat. She was staring forward, looking at her prize, the artifact in front of her, the item she had inadvertently traded Daishi's life for. It stared back. Its pitted and carved surface shined like an oil slick, the markings masterfully carved into it so small they created a glistening effect, where the dim candlelight bounced off its many edges and curves. She would make it worth it. She had to. Over the months that followed, Yurei devoted herself to this artifact in stolen moments, often late into the night when the tower was silent and the corridors lay empty. She would sit for hours, turning it over in her hands, studying its dark surface in hopes its reflections might reveal some hidden pattern. Every day brought new frustration, inscriptions that seemed to shift on orientation, symbols that resisted translation no matter how carefully she had traced them, and mechanisms that moved in ways that made no sense to her until she had studied them again and again and again. Even when she had thought she had understood part of its design, more context would appear in later discoveries, making much of its language contradictory. Many of her painstaking efforts yielded nothing, however, leaving her exhausted and questioning whether she was any closer to uncovering its secrets. The device was intricate beyond anything she had encountered before. Its workings were layered and interwoven, demanding patience, attention, and trial after trial. But after months and months of work, she had finally made a scratch on its surface. A word. Nothing she recognized, but a word and a pronunciation. Feeling nervous, she hid the stone artifact in her robes and scurried out into the dark of the tower, like she had done for many nights to uncover hidden rooms and doors in the tower, many which led nowhere or had no real use, at least anymore. But private space was private space, and Yurei would take that privacy where she could, understanding now how valuable this stone was. It was in one of these dark rooms that she had spoke this word, invoking it within the Boe no Kutaba, guarding herself from what it may do, and she was glad she did, as soon as she spoke the eldritch phrase did ridges form, carving fresh, deep wounds down her lips and through her arms on the utterance of such a phrase. Sitting there, reeling from the blow to her constitution, her head pounded with a headache, and her body stung from the wounds cut open by the word. When she glanced up, she noted the effect of the utterance of the word. It had bisected a clay cup. No, it had not bisected it. It was as if the other half had ceased to exist, as if she had unmade the very substance of it. She sat there for a while, recovering, but would repeat it again and again and again, however never gaining the full strength to say the word in full. The next morning, when she and her fellow students would meet with their mentors for lessons and practicing the voice, her fellow students looked at the deep wounds with concern. Well, that was with an exception to Akane, whose steely gaze settled upon her. As they moved to their mentors, Yurei sat before Ko, who stared at her blankly. Before going to say something, her lips pursed before hesitating and reconsidering. Her face softened slightly, a rare expression for Ko. "Be careful, Yurei," she warned, but there was a care behind it that made Yurei hesitate. "I'll be fine," she replied. "Not about your wounds, girl, but be careful with what you allowed to make them." "I'm fine with the pain," Yurei said, weaker than she would have liked. "No, girl, you misunderstand. Be careful concealing what taught you those words. Many here are ambitious, to say the least, and seeing you with word scars such as those, while being alive, is a threat to them." Yurei glanced around. "Eyes back on me, girl," Ko snapped. "Let's get on with this lesson. I think this week I will switch around from my planned curriculum to something more useful for you." Yurei nodded thankfully. As the day went on, Ko began to teach Yurei on the words of binding. They could bind objects together, but they were often used by many advanced speakers to heal wounds, stitching together open cuts or gashes. Many a warlord would pay handsome sums for these services. However, you will find them useful for more pressing reasons, Yurei. Make sure to hide those large wounds, girl. Otherwise, the others may assign you more. With that, Yurei nodded, glancing over to the other speakers and their students. Looking at Akane, she saw the girl splitting a dummy in twain with her voice alone. She looked away quickly, knowing well that Ko was right. Over the next several weeks, Yurei settled into a harsh routine. Each night, she returned to the hidden chamber and practiced the word again and again. Every utterance carried the same violent recoil. Flesh split along her hands and forearms, as if cut from the inside out. Thin lines at first, but then deeper wounds when her focus slipped. Blood ran down her skin and formed small puddles of crimson on the stone floor. When the pain became too much, she answered it with another set of phrases, Ko's words of mending. The healing phrase closed the damage and knit the flesh together, drawing the torn skin back into place. Those wounds faded to pale scars that slowly softened under repeated use of the words. To anyone glancing at her from a distance, she might not have appeared injured at all. But the restoration was never complete. It merely cured the wounds at a superficial level. Every use of the word demanded something that the mending could not return so easily. Her hands often trembled long after the wounds had closed. A pressure built behind her eyes until her vision blurred red at the edges. Some nights, she barely made it back to her quarters before the exhaustion struck. Still, she continued. Precision came only through repetition. The grammar of the phrase demanded perfect placement of each sound, each breath. A misstep meant pain. A misstep meant worse. All the while, she had continued to keep her practice hidden. The academy was full of watchful eyes now and curious minds. Other students noticed changes quickly. Yurei learned to move carefully through the halls. When the tremors were too strong, she blamed fatigue from studies. When her voice grew hoarse, she claimed illness. Most accepted the excuse. Few did not question her at all. Akane, however, watched more closely than others, a fact Yurei was well aware of. Weeks passed in this uneasy balance, study by day, secrecy and suffering by night. The artifact remained hidden, wrapped carefully and concealed. Each evening, Yurei returned to it, tracing the symbols again and again and again, until their structure felt as familiar as her own breathing. Slowly, the phrase became steadier, the recoil less chaotic. The wounds, while still severe, followed patterns she had begun to anticipate. Yurei began to believe she might master this word, when one night the door to the chamber opened without warning. Yurei had only just returned for practice. The last of the mending words still lingered on her lips. The faint ache in her arms had not yet faded. She turned sharply at the sound. Akane stood in the doorway. She had not bothered with the courtesy or pretense. Her expression was hard. The lantern light from the corridor framed her in sharp shadow. "I know you have it," she said. There was no greeting, no explanation. Her eyes moved across the room with deliberate focus, already searching. "The artifact," Akane continued, her voice low but unwavering. "Give it to me, Yurei." Panic flowed across Yurei as she had not come so far just to give the artifact. Now, had she? But Akane had picked her time well. The word scars were still fresh and pounding on Yurei's skin. while Akane stood there in perfect composure. What would she do?